It is good to see so many of you this morning, both from on Cape and off Cape. This has turned out to be a special occasion for me, as it is not only that I have turned 90, but this will be my last sermon. I am not certain which is more significant for me, turning 90 or preaching last sermon. Whichever, it is good to have you share it with me. I had asked Edmund if I might preach on the Sunday nearest my 90th birthday, and he graciously agreed. I was not certain as to why I wanted to do this, but now I know. It's that last sermon thing. This summer was the 50th anniversary of the historic civil rights marches in Selma, Alabama. At our headquarters in Boston, there is a memorial to the 3 persons killed in Selma, Alabama, during the marches. One was a 26-year-old African-American, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was shot by state troopers when he went to pick up his grandfather. 2 weeks later, a young white Unitarian minister, James Reeb, was beaten to death after participating in the march. 2 weeks later, Unitarian Universalist laywoman from Detroit, Viola Luso, was killed by the Ku Klux Klan while driving to pick up a carload of marchers. The death of Jimmy Lee Jackson received little official or media attention, but the killing of white James Reeb attracted nationwide media coverage. The federal government called out the National Guard to protect the marchers, and President Lyndon Johnson called for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which he signed into law just a few months later. Selma was a major turning point in the civil rights movement. I participated in the march to Montgomery and in Birmingham and was involved in a number of civil rights events at that time. But I had been involved in interracial and civil rights work from the time I had been called to our church in Miami as an assistant minister in 1952. I was called to our Richmond, Virginia church just after the Supreme Court's ruling that segregated schools were unconstitutional. In order to defy the court's decision, Virginia started making plans for closing the public schools in the state. One county, Prince Edward, did close its public schools and set up private schools for white students, which left the black students with no school. My first protest march was in Prince Edward County to protest this action. This was the first time I had faced an angry white mob cursing you and spitting on you. I was recently reminded of this time in my ministry by a passage from a recent book published by the University of Virginia Press. The book, titled Scalawag, was written by a retired professor at the university who had been a civil rights activist and a member of the college-age group in our Richmond church. Quoting from the book, "After a couple of visits to Prince Edward, I went to see the Reverend Gene Pickett, the minister of Richmond's First Unitarian Church. Gene and his church provided safe harbor for all who suffered from the stifling racial humidity of Richmond. I had known him in my student days, and his quiet sense of justice had made a deep impression on me. I especially admired his unsung and courageous leadership in the besieged Virginia Committee to Save the Public Schools, which did indeed spare Richmond and other school districts the fate of Prince Edward. For this, he and his family were under constant threats from a variety of segregationists. End of quote. It was a very complimentary reminder that one's ministry can have a positive influence on the lives of others and on actions as well. I found myself reflecting on these events, but also on my years of ministry in the South during that time of crucial social change. Though our churches and fellowships were few and far between, I think our influence was positive and made a difference for the better in the communities we served. Frequently, it was the Unitarian Universalists who provided leadership and made space available for interracial groups and meetings, often at risk to their own personal safety. I've also been reflecting on the values that informed my ministry then and the values that have given meaning to my life and ministry. During my early and teenage years, a small Methodist church in rural Maryland was the center of my religious and social life. It was a source of acceptance and recognition and provided a steadying influence in the face of my teenage insecurities and uncertainties. But my faith from those years did not withstand the shock of college and my greatly broadened perspective. My years in the Navy during World War II weakened still further my Orthodox faith. Yet, I missed it very much. And my discovery of Unitarianism was one of the most important experiences of my life. Here I found a church where I could explore religious insights and questions of meaning in an accepting and open atmosphere. Here I could express my doubts and uncertainties while belonging to a worshiping and caring community. Here I found a religious approach that respected my rational nature while accepting my need for an emotional base for my religious views. It was this discovery of Unitarianism that motivated me to go to theological school and then into the ministry. My decision to enter the ministry was quite tentative and my motivation unclear. My reasons were both idealistic and selfish. I knew very little about the ministry or Unitarianism. As I recall the statement I wrote as to why I wanted to go into the ministry, it had something to do with working with and helping people, wanting to make this a better world, and I'm certain I must have mentioned something about peace and justice and brotherhood. In other words, I wanted to save the world. At one level, I think I was being honest, but at a deeper and more significant level, I was really saying I wanted to save myself in the sense that I was trying to cope with the most basic of questions. Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? And most particularly, what is the meaning of my life? My own search for meaning was a basic struggle in my ministry. In approaching these questions, two major influences have been most important in my own thinking. These are the ancient philosophy of Stoicism and the modern writings of the French author Albert Camus. Today we think of Stoicism as being primarily a school of ancient philosophy, but from its Greek beginnings to its Roman demise, it was a vigorous religious movement. To a world rent by conflict and confusion, it brought a sense of unity by declaring that the whole universe was one divine essence. Mind, matter, God, humans formed one community. All persons were in truth of one blood. To a society that depreciated and degraded the individual, Stoicism preached a gospel of individual responsibility that urged its hearers to look upon themselves as fragments of the divine. Quote, virtue consists of aiming at the mark, not hitting it. The one who tries hardest is thereby the most successful. The wise person of the Stoics' ideal is like the good athlete who strives to the utmost to play the game. Winning it is not the most important thing. Stoicism was a religion for the strong. It did not teach the practice of virtue as a means to eternal bliss, still less as a means to escape eternal misery. The Stoics fixed their attention on this earthly life. Goodness, here and now, was the goal of life. To be good was to be happy. It preached virtue is its own reward. We do not need the promise of a heaven or a threat of hell to make us do good. While some of their teachings were, of course, the common property of all moral teachers, it was new to put so much emphasis on conduct and character. The late, great Stoic, and probably the most appealing Stoic, was Marcus Aurelius, who became Roman emperor in 169 AD. In his personal life and as emperor, he was an exemplar of the Stoic virtues. But as a leader, either of the state or of religion, he was relatively ineffectual. Though not in his day regarded as a man of letters, it is yet by virtue of his writings that Marcus survives. His journal is today perhaps the most popular book of antiquity. We know it as the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Dubious about the nature of providence, Marcus was agnostic when it came to belief in God. He was cautious concerning human capabilities, and when it came to human conduct, he was insistent on a high degree of virtue and public service. Duty and responsibility were his guidelines. He writes, "Every moment think steadily to do what thou hast in hand with perfect and simple dignity. We exist for the sake of one another. Teach them then, or bear with them." Such is a very brief summary of the ancient philosophy of Stoicism. A modern thinker who embodies in his work and thought something of the emphases and spirit of Stoicism is Albert Camus. He was killed in an automobile accident in 1960. At the age of 46, he had become one of the most influential writers in Europe. He had won the Nobel Prize for Literature at the age of 43. Camus was primarily a man of letters and a poet, not a systematic philosopher. Yet philosophy was his consuming concern. The problem with which he begins is the basic one of meaning. Is there meaning built into the structure of life and the universe? Is there an inherent purpose in life? He writes, "I want to know if I can live with what I know, and only with that." Camus' desire is to know if one can live without appeal to something beyond human experience. Quote, I do not know if this world has a meaning which is beyond me, but I do know that I am not aware of this meaning. For the moment it is impossible for me to see it. I can understand only in human terms. Camus contends that we must respond to a world without evident meaning by reaffirming our individual responsibility and dignity. At the same time, we must recognize our limitations and boundaries and refuse to play God in relations to others or to the universe. His reasoning about the human situation is based on experience and not on abstract reasoning or speculation. The experience of death, nature, suffering, growing old, of joy and sorrow, indifference and compassion, one now dominant and then the other. Out of these alternating themes and emotions arises an elementary ethical principle. According to Camus, we live in a world where children suffer and die. We know that humans die and they're not happy. And so, in such a universe, it is our primary responsibility to do nothing that might increase suffering and unhappiness. And further, we must neglect nothing that might prevent or alleviate misery. To illustrate this point of view, Camus chose Sisyphus from Greek mythology. Sisyphus was condemned to the most futile and hopeless labor. According to tradition, Sisyphus was the wisest and most prudent of mortals, who loved the earth and hated death and the gods. For some reason, an indiscretion regarding the gods or a trick played on death, Sisyphus found himself in Hades. Through persuasion, he was given one last stay on the earth. But once there, and having tasted again the water and the sun and the warm stones in the sea, he determined not to return to Hades and instead stayed with the sea and the earth. Enraged by such audacity, the gods seized Sisyphus and dragged him off to Hades, where his punishment awaited. Sisyphus was condemned for eternity to roll a heavy boulder up to the crest of a mountain from which it would of its own weight crash back down to the bottom. What interests Camus about this myth is that moment when Sisyphus, having reached the summit, watches the boulder as it rolls back down the mountainside and then trails downward himself to take up again his eternal labor. During this pause, which comes as regularly as his painful labor, Camus understands that Sisyphus sees clearly the limits and the boundaries of his existence. He has seen his destiny, and though he entertains no false hopes of succeeding, he becomes his own master. He stands facing a universe which he no longer deceives him. And Camus concludes, I leave Sisyphus at the bottom of the mountain. His burden is always there. But Sisyphus teaches the higher loyalty which denies the gods but moves boulders. The struggle itself toward the summit is enough to fill the heart of this man. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Here then are two approaches to life, one ancient, one modern, both putting the responsibility of the individual to work out his or her own meaning. Both affirm the simple virtues of honesty and sincerity, individual integrity, and responsibility for the larger community. Both say that meaning we seek is not in the future, nor is it beyond our knowing. The meaning is within us, part of our nature, and is to be found in the sensitivities and tensions of a life lived fully in relation to others. Most importantly, we have choices, and we must choose. Moral sensitivity begins with the belief that there is in every situation a better and a worse choice. Choices between acts that are life-affirming and those that are life-denying, between the creative and the destructive, between reconciliation and hostility. Our capacity for making choices and acting on preferences gives us a way to create meaning and develop standards of behavior. This approach to creating meaning and developing a moral sensitivity requires a courage and a faith worthy of the Stoics and Camus, the kind of courage described by one philosopher as follows, quote, "The backbone of life is the power to endure. Another, possibly even greater power is found in creating right relations with people. If you wish a single word for that power, it is caring." Out of these two powers, the one of endurance and the other of caring, one can come to learn a meaningful way of life. These are what I consider to be essentials of a meaningful and a caring life. These are the cornerstones of my religious faith. They help me with the basic questions: why am I here? What am I trying to do, and for what purpose? Why strive? The answer for me, in its simplest form, is because I care. Because it matters to me, even if to no one else. The center of my striving for meaning, of giving purpose to living, of keeping faith with persons, of holding out hope for a better future, is based on the quite simple, though difficult proposition: I care. I did ministry in the South for 27 years to help create a more equal and just community because I cared. I marched in Washington for voting rights because I cared. I opposed the Vietnam War because I cared. And I worked to grow and strengthen our liberal religious movement because I cared. I have been motivated and sustained in the ministry because of that simple but difficult proposition: I care even though the universe may not. This is expressed a little differently by Joan of Arc as portrayed in Maxwell Anderson's play. Joan, the simple peasant maid who followed the inspiration of her own heart, is summoned to defend herself before the highest authorities. In all the world, she says, there is for nobody any authority but one's own soul. Then you choose death, says the inquisitor. And Joan answers, and what if I offer my life for this choice? I know this: everyone offers their lives for what they believe. One life is all we have, and we live it as we think we should, then it is over. But denying what you are and living without belief, this is more terrible than dying young. Your answer to the basic questions of life may not and need not be the same as mine. The important thing is that Unitarian Universalism gives us the freedom and provides the community which supports our search for meaning, which challenges and encourages us in our search. But for me, endurance and love, kindness and caring, living with belief without denying what you are, that is the essence of meaning in my life and in my ministry.